So I'm not looking at it at the moment. Is anybody giving you a thumbs up? Okay. Interesting. Let's do it the other way around then. So if I mute that. Okay. Let's go up there. And you've unmuted there. Okay, can you hear me now on the Zoom call? Yeah? All good? Lovely. Fantastic. Thank you very much for your patience, everybody. Sorry it took a little bit longer than usual. And I'm hoping that anyone who feels that our slightly jury-rigged arrangement here isn't easy for them can decide to perhaps just look on their phone or something like that if they want to see the slides. Welcome to the Café Scientifique for November 2023. We're nearly a year now since we restarted again. We restarted in December last year, and it's great that we've been able to keep this going. And as usual, fantastic support from this department. Interestingly, the two speakers we have tonight have a little bit of an overlap, I suppose, with this department in some ways, but I'll get onto that in a minute. Just some normal housekeeping. If the fire alarm goes, we exit, obviously, drop everything and go. The two main places go out to the main stairs. The lift will obviously stop working if there's a fire alarm. The floors, remember, we're going down to floor 1, which is the ground floor, not 0. Sometimes people have exited the evening and ended up in the basement, so you just go down to 1. But the potentially quicker way may be down the back stairs, which are the fire stairs over there. When we're out, if you could please get away from the building over towards where the barrier is, because they've shut off the back area of this building now for works. If you get over near where the car barrier is to exit the area, just stay there and don't go. Just going to need to do a head count to make sure we've got everybody, because the fireman will ask, and we need to be sure we've got everyone out. If anyone here needs the loos, they are just across the hall and on the right. And obviously, I hope that people will feel they can go and fill up with snacks and drinks whenever they want to, not feel worried about getting up. It's very informal tonight. If people need to go for buses later in the evening, that's absolutely fine. We do completely understand the difficulties of getting in and out of central Oxford nowadays. So I'm delighted tonight to welcome a pair of absolute dynamos. So nearer me we've got Susie Murphy, Professor Susie Murphy, and then further away Dr. Angharad Is that how you say it? Excellent, fantastic. Angharad is a clinical postdoc fellow and a specialty registrar in general adult psychiatry, with a particular expertise in self-harm, I presume studying it rather than doing it, neurocognition, and also psychopharmacology, which is rather what tonight's going to be about. And Susie is also rather cross-disciplinary, university research lecturer who started her science career at St Andrews before moving down here to Oxford. She's got expertise in brain imaging, psychology, psychopharmacology, and general neuroscience. Both of them are members of the Department of Psychiatry. They could probably just as easily fit in this department as well. And I'm delighted to hand over to them. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So thank you for that really kind introduction. So we're just going to kick off today by sort of Susie and I talked about depression and perhaps thinking about sort of new treatments for depression and how we might kind of come up with those. But to start with, I suppose we sort of want to acknowledge that depression is a really common illness. So we probably all have known somebody with depression, perhaps through our work life, perhaps through our home life. We might have had depression ourselves. And so it's really interesting to be able to come and talk to you today about it and sort of hear your perspectives, because I think it's a topic where we all have kind of some experience. But to start us off, we're going to ask you some questions, actually. So you should all have some coloured bits of paper in front of you and some pens. And people online, perhaps you can think of these in your heads, but we're going to get the people in the room to do a bit of work. And so I probably want you to kind of perhaps get closer to somebody that if you're perhaps sitting slightly further away, perhaps move next to somebody so you can have a chat about these questions. And I want you to, perhaps I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to discuss them between yourselves, come up with an answer and write it down on your piece of paper, and we'll see how we do. So the first question is, so what percentage of the population do you think are suffering from clinical depression at this time, if we take UK adults? So what percentage of the population do you think have depression at the moment, in terms of UK adults? If you perhaps chat between yourselves and write it down on a bit of paper.
Just carry on. I need to just share the screen first.
Brilliant. So has everyone come up with an answer, do they think? They've got a percentage? Okay, so hold on to that for a moment and I'm going to ask you a second question. Okay, so now, what percentage do you think of the population are taking an antidepressant? So what percentage of the population are taking an antidepressant?
Is that better, Kate? Oh, it's appearing. Don't move it. Like this. Oh, so it's showing that one. That's more troublesome.
Is it
sharing screen showing the presenter view?
Is it? Okay. Let's just
go to your register.
just go through. If you pause the share, I think do we do that? Or swap?
No, just swap it. It's just
No, but it'll display it on there, you see. Just start it. Yeah, just start it again. That's what we can do. Yeah.
Better?
Yeah, is it better to stand here actually? Because I think I'm in the screen there.
No, you're in at the moment. Oh, all good.
But if I go here, am I out?
No.
No? Okay.
No, it's gone right
Perfect. Okay. Brilliant. Have we got two answers then? Okay. So perhaps if we have a look. So for question one, what proportion of the population should we perhaps hold up our answers? So for question one, what proportion of the population do we think have clinical depression at the moment? Okay, so what have we got? We've got, so for people online, for benefit people online, we've got 10%, 25%, 5%, 20%, 1 in 5, 5%. Okay, so somewhere between 5% and 25%. Does that sound fair? Okay, and then for the second question, so what percentage of people do we think are taking antidepressants at the moment? We've got 7.5%, that's very precise, very precise. 1/10, 5% again, 5%, 15%, 5%, 4%. Okay, so somewhere, again, very precise. So somewhere between 4% and probably, I think someone had 10%, didn't they? Oh, 15, okay, brilliant. So, now, if I press that, does that move on? Oh, it's not moving on now. Okay, we'll just do it that way. Okay. So, as we were meant to do, this sort of talks about the fact that, as we talked about, depression really is a leading cause of health, ill health and disability around the world. So, depending on how you sort of evaluate it, the World Health Organization sort of puts it somewhere in the top 3. And in the UK, probably around 1 in 5 people currently have moderate to severe depression symptoms. So that's a big proportion of the population, isn't it? Oh.
Could you turn the lights down, please?
Is it too bright to see?
I cannot read the writing.
Yeah, we've got the
So if you-
too far. It's all right.
How's that? Is that better?
That's all right. Yeah.
Can you see better? Is that better? Yeah? Okay. Okay. And about 17% of people are probably taking antidepressants at the moment. So actually, our figures that we were guessing weren't too far off. And really that just sort of tells us how important a topic it is and how we really need to think about antidepressants. Okay, and so as Rich said, so I'm a medical doctor that specialises in thinking about mental illnesses, and particularly I've chosen to spend quite a bit of my research career thinking about depression. At this point, I suppose we just felt it was important to say that antidepressants are really important. They are one of our key sort of strategies that we have to treat depression, but they're not the only thing we think about when we're talking about treating depression. It's also really important to think about diet and exercise and sleep, and they're often the things that we talk about with patients first. And equally, we have this other sort of big arm of treatment. You've probably heard of our talking therapies, the psychological therapies. Okay, brilliant. And I think it was over to you, isn't it?
This might. Can you hear me speaking to this? Or maybe I might just.
Let's just do that.
Okay. So, thank you.
So one of the perhaps surprising things when we think about depression and how common it is when we do these sort of population level surveys is that actually we've got really effective ways of treating depression. So as Angharad said, we can treat depression with drugs, with antidepressants, we can treat it with psychological therapy, and we know that both of those approaches to treating depression are effective. So you might have seen in the media lots of controversy, antidepressants don't work, they're no better than placebo. But as scientists, when we pull together the evidence that we've got, we see a clear message that the antidepressants that we have are more effective than placebo. So what you can see here on the screen is a meta-analysis. This is a network meta-analysis that was conducted by Andrea Cipriani, who's here in Oxford. And what he did, this enormous project of pooling together all of the data that there is from all of the trials that have been run, both by pharmacological industry, but also outside of industry, so by academics like us. So this was data from over 110,000 patients, over 500 different trials, and he put it all into this analysis where he said, okay, compared to placebo, are these drugs more effective? And he looked at the 21 most commonly used antidepressants, and the take-home message was really against what the media wants us to sometimes believe. In fact, all 21 of these drugs were significantly more effective than placebo, and that's what you can see here. So this is a kind of line. If any of these data points crossed this line, it would mean that they weren't significantly more effective than placebo. And you can see some of them are more effective than others, but overall, all of them are effective. But they're not perfect. So a significant proportion of patients don't respond to the current drugs that we have. So there's been studies that have looked at this in a kind of pragmatic way. So looking, okay, if you take a group of people with depression, you start them on an SSRI, what's the kind of number of people that are likely to show good response? And to the first treatment, it's about a third of people show a good response to the antidepressant. And then if you try other treatment approaches, perhaps one of the other drugs that are included in the list I showed you, or add in some psychological therapy, you can get up to about 2/3 of patients showing a good clinical response. But what that means, and what's important for people like us who work in the field, is that there's a significant minority of patients, so about a third of patients don't show a response to all of the treatment options that we have for depression. And that's a real motivator for us to think about how to develop better treatments. So one of the reasons why this might be the case is that the drugs that we have are mechanistically very similar. So some of you might know, but many of the drugs that we use in psychiatry were discovered serendipitously. So it's actually not through the usual path of understanding what's going on in a disorder and then developing a drug to treat that problem, and then there's your treatment. We actually do things a bit back to front in psychiatry. It's very difficult to develop treatments in that way because we don't actually really understand the causes of many of the mental illnesses that we study. So antidepressants, but also many of the other drugs that we use in psychiatry, have tended to be discovered by chance. So drugs that have been developed for another disorder have then turned out to have antidepressant properties. And that was the case in the 1950s with antidepressants. And then since then, we've had an enormous drive to develop better drugs, but they've all tended to do the same thing. So in the case of antidepressants, they increase or potentiate or increase the function of the serotonin system in the brain. And the newer drugs that we've got, perhaps do that more selectively, and that often means that they perhaps have a smaller side effect profile, but actually they're not doing anything particularly new compared to the drugs that were discovered by chance. Antidepressants have a relatively slow onset in their effects, so although they have their effects in the brain within hours of taking the first dose, actually it takes several weeks, if not months, before patients start to feel any better. And there are also some symptoms that aren't treated very well with our existing drugs. So some of the cognitive symptoms, the problems with memory and concentration, for example, aren't well treated by the drugs that we have. So as I said, there's been huge efforts to improve the treatments that we have for depression. And one of the questions that I think it's worth asking in the field is, why haven't we done a better job? Why are we still relying on these drugs that were discovered by chance so long ago? Well, as I've said, we have a limited knowledge of the cause of depression. We're kind of limited in the tools that we have within this field. So we're very reliant on patients' self-report of their symptoms. We don't have blood tests or even fMRI scans that allow us to diagnose depression. We don't really understand how our existing treatments work. So one of the problems with discovering things by chance, serendipitously, is that you sort of have to then backtrack to understand, well, why would this drug that increases serotonin function treat depression? We have a variable clinical response. So that means that some patients show a good response and some people don't. And we don't really understand why that is either. But perhaps one of the biggest challenges in this field is the limitations of our animal models. So it's, as I've said, really difficult to study something like depression, and it's almost impossible to study it in animals because we're so reliant on the self-report. And so if you think about what happens in drug treatment, you tend to start with very intense activity in animals. Drug companies spend a lot of time using these, what we call preclinical models, and then they find something that they think look good, and then they put it into clinical trials. But then for a long period of time, these clinical trials are very focused on, is this drug safe to give to humans? What dose should we give it at? Really establishing whether the drug that they've developed is doing what they want it to in the brain. And then it's only later, much later in the developmental pathway, that it goes into very expensive, big clinical trials. And what typically happens in a field like depression is that these drugs fail at that point. So the company, the industry, has invested a huge amount of money with this new drug that they think looks hopeful, but actually what they saw in those early animal studies isn't predictive of what it's going to do in humans. And that's an enormous problem, and it has led to many pharmaceutical companies saying, we're just not going to develop drugs in this space anymore, it's too difficult, we're going to go and do something where we know what the underlying cause is. So what we do, and the kind of challenge that we set ourselves in the work that we do here in Oxford, is to think, well, can we develop models, like the models that are used in animals, but models that we can use in humans? So much earlier on, can we take potential new treatments that we think might be useful and test them in humans, even potentially in healthy volunteers, rather than waiting for these kind of late-stage, large clinical efficacy trials. And Angharad's going to tell you a bit about how we do that.
Thanks, Susie. So we're back to the slide that we were talking about earlier, and really we put this back up to kind of talk through through kind of how we think about antidepressants and them working, and how perhaps we do that slightly differently, or why we're trying to do it slightly differently. So often when we think about antidepressants, particularly perhaps thinking about antidepressants in this department, people will be thinking about what effects do our drugs have on circuits, brain circuits? What effects do they have on the brain cells themselves? But what's quite interesting is that, as I mentioned, we have this other branch of treatments that work really well for depression, psychological therapies, which we know they're effective for depression because part of the thing that they do is they have an impact on our thoughts, on our thought processes. And so what we thought was quite interesting is to think about, okay, so what effects do antidepressants have on thought processes? So when we think about those thought processes that are kind of important in depression and how they're affected, one of the main ones is information processing. So we know that people who are depressed view themselves and the world and their surroundings in a negative way. And they have this negative bias about everything. So this is kind of a bit similar to how we all are. So we can all have times when we perhaps view the same thing in a kind of negative way. And Susie's got a very good example we're going to talk about in a moment about exactly what that is.
Okay, I'm just going to give you one example, but it's a very everyday phenomenon. So perhaps by telling you about this example, you'll think of ways in which your mood state affects the way that you view the world or how you remember things. So this was a text that I received from a friend of mine last year. She's called Lydia, and she texted me out of the blue, "I've had a haircut and I hate it." She's quite blunt. She says, "It was a different hairdresser, and he didn't listen to what I said. It's shorter than I like. He's done layers too short at the back. I just want to hide my head." And by this stage I was thinking, oh my goodness, I wonder what she looks like. It sounds really bad. But a really awful day at work, and this is the last straw. So I went to bed thinking, oh, I'd better give Lydia a ring tomorrow and see what she's going to do about her haircut. But in the morning, I had this text message, "Feeling much better this morning. Oh, I think I like my new hair." So this is a classic example. It can happen to any of us at any point in our day-to-day lives. And what's interesting about this example is that the haircut doesn't change. So the haircut is a kind of ambiguous, unexpected event. It wasn't how she thought she wanted to have her haircut. And when she was in a negative mood, so long day at work, feeling tired, her interpretation of that event was negative. And then in a completely different mood state, feeling much fresher in the morning, she's able to take the same event but interpret it in a completely different way. And as Angharad said, these sorts of biases are very common for us all, but in depression, people tend to get stuck in that negative bias state. So when they interpret things in their world, when they remember information, when they pay attention to certain things, there's a negative bias. And what's useful for us as experimenters is that we can measure this using computer-based tasks. So it allows us to move away from this reliance on people being able to tell us about their internal world and what's going on for them, and actually allows us to use objective markers of their processing of information. And one of the ways that we do that is using facial expressions. So Angharad's going to give you a little test to see how good you are at this.
Okay, so this time I won't get you to write things down. I might just get you to shout out, and maybe we'll go kind of, we'll get everyone to shout out. So, if we look at this face, what expression do you think this face is showing? Grumpy, annoyed, any other?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure yet? No, and I think that's a really good point. So the first face I'm going to show you in each of these pairs is going to be a bit ambiguous. Okay, and this is what we're talking about, where this interpretation of what you're seeing kind of really comes to play. When things are obvious, they're obvious, and actually Susie's going to show you the obvious one now.
Okay.
Is that a bit clearer? Yeah. So what you see first time was that ambiguous one, where your brain was having to interpret what it was. It wasn't obvious. You were having to think, and actually, what we're saying is how that sort of inner state, how you were feeling, had a bearing on how you would interpret that ambiguous face. So, you're getting a hang of this. Next one. Okay, what do we think about this one? Any thoughts? Worried, surprised, scared, yeah, worried, surprised, scared. Again, you see these ambiguous ones are quite tricky. Then you're going to see the more obvious one. This is a bit clearer there. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. And we've got one more. See.
Oh, smile.
Smile. Okay, yeah. Everybody agree and we disagree? Pleased, yeah? Yeah, and then it's more clear on that one. So hopefully you're beginning to get an idea of perhaps how we can look at how different people in different situations might be looking at the same ambiguous facial expression and might be interpreting that in different ways.
So we use these kinds of stimuli, particularly the ambiguous ones, to start to test both how things have changed in people with depression, but critically what the drugs that we use to treat depression do to these kinds of processing biases. So obviously, as Angharad demonstrated, if you show a face that it's full of emotion, everybody's able to recognise that. But if you morph faces together and start looking at people's responses to these very ambiguous faces, that's when these subtle biases in your processing of emotion start to play out. So I'm going to show you some data now. This is quite small, so don't worry if you can't see it. I'll talk you through the kind of key points. But essentially, what we see in these kinds, using computer tasks that tap into this ability to recognise expressions on people's faces or remember emotional information, is that in people with depression, which you can see in this graph here, you see a negative bias. So this is accuracy to recognise happiness in these ambiguous morphed faces. And in the blue, depressed patients are significantly worse at identifying happy in the faces of others compared to healthy volunteers. But perhaps the most exciting thing that we found in our research here in Oxford, and we found this quite some time ago now, is that if you give people an antidepressant, just a single dose of an antidepressant, you can reverse that bias. So that's what you can see plotted here. So this is a single dose of a commonly used antidepressant. And in grey, these are the depressed patients after that antidepressant compared with a group of depressed people who were given a placebo, so a dummy drug. And just a few hours after they've taken this single dose of an antidepressant, this has affected their recognition of happiness in these facial expressions. And the reason that that's really exciting is that it's occurring way before the clinical effects of the drug. So as I told you at the beginning, antidepressants typically don't start affecting mood for at least 4 weeks, often longer. But here, after a single dose, we're picking up this subtle change in the processing of these social cues. And this has given us some ideas about how antidepressants might be working and what's going on in that delay period between when you first take the antidepressant and when you start feeling better. In the context of drug development, though, the other thing that's really interesting is that we can see these effects also in healthy volunteers. So these are healthy volunteers who have been given 3 different antidepressants. This is their recognition of happiness on the y-axis, and this is as the intensity of the happiness in the face goes up. And you can see that the 3 antidepressants are behaving quite similarly, and it's really around this ambiguous point. So when the happy face is about 30% or 40% happy, the antidepressant is improving the performance, the ability to recognise happiness in these faces. So this is really important for our drug development, because this means that even in the very first time that these drugs are given to humans, we're able to start including these kinds of tasks to say, well, is this drug behaving a bit like a conventional antidepressant? So getting an early kind of indicator that it might have that sort of clinical profile when it's taken into clinical trials later on. And we can also use fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging, so brain scanning, to also look at the processing of emotion after a drug. So this is some data where we showed people these faces while they were lying in the scanner and looked at activity in the area of the brain called the amygdala, which is really responsive to salient social information and emotional information. And what we saw again just after a single dose of an antidepressant was the amygdala became much less responsive to the threatening, fearful faces that we showed people. So that's really consistent with what we're seeing in the behavioural computer tasks, that people are kind of showing a shift in their processing of emotion away from negative and towards positive.
Yes, so we're really sort of coming to the end of our sort of us talking maybe to you, but it'd be really interesting to hear sort of your thoughts. So just to sum up, really, we've talked about the fact that depression is common, that the current options we have for medication treatment all have problems and limitations, and actually it's been really hard to try and find new antidepressants that sort of get past some of these problems. But perhaps we can use human models sort of to move that process forward based on what we understand happens to our thinking processes when we are depressed. And we're going to kind of just leave these up, but here are some questions that perhaps we thought, oh, this is what we might ask, so you might be interested to sort of chat to us about. But again, please, if you have other thoughts, then we'd be more than happy to hear them. But it's just really thinking about perhaps how we've used these human models. There are some new antidepressants that you've probably heard about in the media, and we can maybe talk about those a little bit. We can talk about where we see the future of depression going, and maybe sort of Susie touched on that there may be different causes of depression, and we can have a chat about those. And then there's a final one, which is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek one, that it sort of bases a bit on what I did my PhD on, which is thinking about perhaps a drug that we use for a different purpose as a laxative, and how that might be an antidepressant. So that's all from us, and it would be great to hear some thoughts from you.
Thank you very much indeed. That's given us lots to think about. We're going to take a 5-minute break in the room. If you want to stop recording, Kelly, and then people who want to chat online can. And we will... Okay, so we're recording again now. There are quite a few questions on the chat. My own Zoom call on my phone switched off, so I'm going to come and look over to Kelly's shoulder in a minute to read them out. We also have people in the room, so I'm just going to kick off myself to say, God, yeah, obviously as a chemist I'm interested. You were talking about how serotonin's of the thing that most people have focused on, serotonin uptake. What direction are new drugs going in? I know you said there are some where you've picked up that there's an antidepressive effect, which may not be expected, but is it attacking different things in the brain? What can you say about that?
Yeah, good question. I think now is a really exciting moment in the treatment of depression. We kind of, I guess if you'd asked us 10 years ago, things had got a little bit sad on the development of new treatment front, so we were kind of stuck a bit, as I've described, in this kind of rut of just having some new drugs, but they were essentially doing the same thing. And in the last 10 years, there's been a really exciting kind of development in terms of new drugs and treatments that have completely novel mechanisms. And ketamine is a great example of that. So ketamine, some of you will know as a horse anaesthetic, some will know as a street drug, but also ketamine, when given at a low dose, is also an effective treatment for depression. And what's exciting about that is it's a completely different system that it's affecting in the brain. So it's affecting the glutamate system, and this has stimulated lots of interest in this as a kind of completely novel target for antidepressant treatment development. And one of the particularly exciting things about it is it's got a different clinical profile. So instead of having to wait for many weeks before you feel better, the effects are almost instantaneous. So it's kind of stimulated a real interest in the potential to have what we call fast onset or fast acting antidepressants. So yeah, exciting times.
And potentially could be taken with things that are, you know, able to be longer acting, so you could get the benefit of both?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And we haven't really optimised how to give ketamine in relation to other drugs yet, but one of the things it's particularly good for is when people are very unwell, in crisis, perhaps suicidal, and you haven't got time to wait several weeks, and ketamine's got a particular role there. Or in the most extremely unwell patients who haven't shown a good response to SSRI treatment, then ketamine is particularly used in those patients. Yeah.
At the back, push the knobs up. That's it, right all the way up.
There we go. Yes, yeah, absolutely. And that's what I was going to mention, just in addition to that, is that yes, ketamine is very quick acting, but it doesn't last very long. So one of the problems we have with it is that if for people who are using it as a longer term treatment, So for those people who have depression that haven't responded to other medications but do seem to respond to ketamine, they do require regular top-ups of it. So that's one thing that perhaps in the future we may be able to formulate it such that that's not the case, or find a way around that.
Lovely. Do we have any questions or comments in the room?
Could we?
Yeah.
Was the top antidepressant amitriptyline?
Yes.
Oh,
It's not-
right.
Yeah.
Well, I was prescribed that for irritable bowel syndrome
Yeah.
about 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, is this one of your accidental
So amitriptyline
discoveries?
is,
You're right. No, it's only because he was talking.
Oh,
so it'll work again. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can shut off. It's right. No, it's fine. Right, here we go.
Yeah, so amitriptyline came out of that analysis that was done as the kind of most effective antidepressant. And it's really interesting to spot that because, as you've said, it's one of the oldest antidepressants. It's, you know, despite all of this work trying to develop better, more selective antidepressants, actually amitriptyline is one of the first drugs that's not very selective for serotonin. It also impacts upon other neurotransmitters in the brain, so noradrenaline, for example, and dopamine. And so it's what's called a tricyclic antidepressant. And one of the things that we've realised, really, as time's gone by, is that making more selective drugs is good in terms of not having lots of side effects, but it actually seems to make the antidepressants less effective. So it's not really that what you need is something that only impacts upon the serotonin system. These drugs that are, if you like, a bit dirtier seem to be more effective.
Yeah, and that probably relates to, we've been talking a little bit about the fact that, you know, depression is a really broad concept. And actually, I think, you know, when it's a bit like when we talk about, you know, coma, there's not one cause of coma. So depression is a way that the brain has of responding to a problem that's happening. And so probably those kind of broader drugs that target lots of different things, possibly one of the reasons why they're more effective is they're probably covering more reasons, more underlying chemical reasons of why people might be depressed.
Interesting. Louis, go behind you there first. So just to say, that's on the same circuit as the speakers, so it's fine. Is it on, Louis?
Yeah, I think it's
Perfect.
Hello.
So you know that in our lab, so we established the depression-like animal model, use the mice and the rat. So you know we put the mice in the tube, so maybe for a long time. So they don't have the food and water, just can breathe freely. So for 2 weeks or 4 weeks, we can establish the mice and in the rat depression mode. You know. Also, we can use the drug injection to introduce the animal depression like model, right?
Yeah.
But I cannot understand the human model. So can you introduce the understanding about the human models? Yeah.
Sure.
So just to
Yeah,
find...
that's right. Yeah. So I mean that how can we understand the human models to developing the new antidepressant? Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just comparing the way that animal models work, which is where you control their mood by controlling their access to food and water over a long time, and then inject them with the drugs, and then see what the outcomes is, and really the comparison to the human model. Do you want to go?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a few animal models that have been used for a long time to test drugs against. So one type of animal model, which is like you're explaining, is you sort of induce a depressed state in the animal, usually by using some kind of stressor, so some kind of chronic stress, and it can be, as you described, restricting access to food, making their lives pretty awful, and then you do start to see some behaviours in the animals that are sort of have some sort of validity as a model of depression. I guess one of the reasons why there's been a sort of move against relying entirely on these models, is that although they do respond to conventional antidepressants, they do seem to have sort of created the situation where we've got lots of drugs that are very similar to the drugs that we already have. And so one of the criticisms that has been made against some of the animal models that we have is that perhaps we're creating models that are sensitive to the antidepressants that we already have, rather than that they're really a model of what's going on in depression. And perhaps that's why our drugs are so similar to the ones that we had 50, 70 years ago. And so one of the things that's happened in the field is starting to think, well, if we're able to model what depression is like in using behaviour in humans, maybe we can then back translate that into our animal models. So rather than saying, yeah, this kind of looks like depression, actually saying, okay, well, here's a process that we know is related to depression in humans. So some of the tasks that we've been showing you, obviously you can't do it with facial expression, but you can do it in terms of how biased are you towards thinking something is positive or negative if it's ambiguous. How much are you likely to kind of assume that it's the positive interpretation of that rather than the negative interpretation? And there's been some lovely work really looking at that literature and saying, okay, we get that that's a behavioural readout in humans that's related to depression. Let's try and take that back into animal models. So there's a researcher in Bristol called Emma Robinson, and she's really tried to develop effective bias measures in animals. So she, for example, trains them that one tone means that they're going to get a reward, another tone means that they're not going to get a reward, and then she plays them a tone that's kind of in between those and takes a behavioural readout. Is the animal thinking it's the rewarded tone or the less or the not rewarded tone? And so really trying to say, okay, how do we get these animal models to match what we can measure in humans? And I think that's a real step forward in the field, really, in terms of being able to kind of use them in drug development.
And it's nicer for the animals as well, I think.
I'm just going to go online, then we'll come back to you in the room. So, you go... Sorry, I want to go to the top ones, which I know I haven't seen. Good grief, there's a whole load. Okay, hang on. There we go. So, how effective, can we give some numbers here, are psychiatric talk therapies compared to antidepressants? I.e., can the talk therapies from an experienced good psychiatrist cure a depressed patient?
Oh, great question. So what we know is quite interesting is that really the ideal situation is both. So if in an ideal world, everybody should be offered a psychological therapy, and actually if you're kind of fairly depressed, the ideal situation is also to have a medication. So to have a medication and a talking therapy. If you take them individually, they are as good as each other, really. But there are going to be certain situations and certain people for whom one might be better than the other, and that's, I think, where we also have to bear in mind that sort of individual nature and try and sort of tailor our therapy to the right person. But yeah, they are pretty much as good as each other. But the ideal situation, and what NICE, which is kind of one body that sort of suggests treatments for all disorders, really suggests that you should give them both.
Yeah, I think it's worth also noting that it's not very straightforward to do that head-to-head comparison, because with talking therapy you don't have a good control group. So you always know that you're in the active condition, you always know that you're receiving the therapy, and that would be a bit like testing an antidepressant against nothing. So we've got, on the one hand, antidepressant trials that are really tightly controlled, double-blind, with a placebo, and then we kind of see a difference, but it's relatively small. And then when we look at psychological therapies, we can't really do it with the same level of precision to really unpick which is the active bit of this. And so when you try and compare them, it gets a bit murky because you don't really know what you're comparing and what's a fair comparison. But if we look at how they're used clinically, we can see that both are effective, and the combination is, as Angharad says, the ideal scenario.
I'm just going to come here first. She's on.
It's just interference.
It's just the interference, yeah. Can you turn us off briefly, Susie? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's very enjoyable, especially the facial recognition. With the antidepressant drugs, does it just affect the looking for the happiness ones, or does it affect their ability at looking at the other types, the fear and those, and does that change the way that non-depressed people look at those pictures as well?
Can you hear me now? Yeah, great question. And I sort of showed you simplified graphs just for the sake of this evening, but it does exactly what you're saying. So antidepressants don't just increase the processing of the positive or the identification of the positive, but they also tend to decrease the accuracy with which people recognise fearful and angry faces. And what's really interesting is what are the faces being misclassified as? And so you can do that analysis and you say, okay, well, if somebody looks at a really ambiguous face that we know is like 20% fear, what are they then saying it is if they're not saying it's fear? And you can see actually, when Angharad did the test, you could see that some people were saying that the fearful face was surprised. And that's a classic example of a positive bias, because it could be fear or it could be surprise. There's some similarities between those, but one's quite a positive emotion and one's quite a negative emotion. And so that's what we think the antidepressants are doing. They're kind of just shifting at that very ambiguous point in your perception, you to just jump or be more likely to jump to the more positive interpretation.
And of course, I didn't say...
But that's interesting when you think about this delay, because if you've taken a drug that shifted your perception of people's faces in that quite subtle way, and then you go out into the world, suddenly you're, I don't know, in the supermarket paying for your food and somebody's looking at you, they're not kind of grinning at you or scowling at you, but they're just giving these really subtle social signals. And you know, the model that we worked with is the idea that actually you need to do that quite a lot for it to have an impact on your mood. But perhaps if you go out to the supermarket and feel that, you know, the person that you're interacting with is positive, you might be more likely the next day to go out and do something else. And over time, you start getting experience of the world with this more positive frame. And that's why, you know, after several weeks of that, you start experiencing a change in your mood. So it's kind of iterative process.
Very interesting.
Do you want to switch on?
Yeah, thanks, Susie.
So I was wondering whether there's any insights that can be gained from postnatal depression, and also like milk, if you can look at the baby and understand their state of mind. I don't suppose that's easy with a newborn baby, but just understand what's in the milk and what, because they're genetically different, but the milk is from the mother. And I was also interested in laxatives, if you could talk about that.
So, sorry, I'm just going to get a clarity. So, when you're talking about the first bit on postnatal depression, and you're talking about the mother and the baby being genetically different, but...
But the milk is could have hormones and other things.
Oh,
that could,
okay.
affect both of them.
Okay. So you're absolutely right that postnatal depression is a really good example of sort of a hormone, what we think is probably a hormonally induced depression. So what we know is that kind of after birth, your hormones play havoc as a mother. And you probably know that the baby blues, as we kind of term it, is really common. So a couple of days after birth, it's really common to feel that the world is terrible. But we know that then obviously after that, most people's hormone stabilises, and that they sort of recover from this brief period of baby blues. But for some people, kind of that ends up turning into a much longer running depression. I think it's also, this is why depression is so interesting, because it's incredibly complicated. So obviously the other problem in thinking about postnatal depression is that although there's really good biological reasons for why people might become depressed, because they've had this hormonal shift, and it probably exposes some vulnerabilities that people may have genetically as well. So again, as you know, postnatal depression, if it's one in your family, you're much more likely to have postnatal depression. So, but then equally, you've completely changed somebody's social context by having a baby, haven't you? And you're depriving them of sleep, and you've given them a massive social responsibility. And so it's kind of not surprising that this is a kind of really critical point. Thinking about the milk and whether kind of there's anything that the milk can tell us, that's a great question. I don't think I know anything about. We know that obviously that bonding that happens, which is really important and doesn't necessarily happen, or happens to a lesser extent in people who have postnatal depression, relates to the oxytocin that gets released, which is often kind of relates to lactation. But whether there's anything biologically in the milk, I don't know if you know anything about that.
No, I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah, maybe that's a scientific avenue to explore. Yeah.
I'm going to cut off on the laxatives just in a moment. I've got masses of stuff in the room. I'm just going to go to another one online. I'm going to have to be very selective here and see what would be good, particularly. Okay, I'm going to try this one because it's off the drug area, but just because it's interesting. Can similar changes be shown? It's probably for Susie with her brain scanning. In scanning the amygdala after non-pharmacological therapies, for instance, chanting or meditation or contemplation?
Yeah, really good question. So it's really hard to find a good scientific way to look at the effects of something like a psychological therapy, because you sort of have to decide what you're going to get the people to do while they're in the scanner, and that has a really big impact on what you see and which areas of the brain you activate while they're lying in the scanner. But one of the kind of messages that has come out of the work that's been done suggests that antidepressants seem to affect these very evolutionarily old structures in our brain, like the amygdala, which are kind of primed to give us our very fast automatic responses to emotional information. And when we look at the effects of therapy, this seems to have a different impact on more prefrontal cortical areas. So these are the areas that are pretty uniquely human. They allow us to kind of control our responses to things. So an example might be, you are sitting in a room, you hear a shuffling, and your amygdala might kind of go, oh my goodness, it's, maybe it's a snake. And your prefrontal cortex would be going, oh, don't be ridiculous, you're in your office, you're not in a jungle, there aren't any snakes. And so that kind of human ability to control our very basic emotional responses. And what's important is those two networks are very connected. So the prefrontal cortex can regulate the activity that you see in the amygdala, and the amygdala can drive responses in the prefrontal cortex as well. But we think that the drugs are impacting upon those more basic responses, and the therapy is impacting more on those more cognitive, strategic, conscious ways that we control our emotion. So that's why probably they're good to give together as well. And it's all part of the kind of same system, but coming at it from a slightly different way.
I can absolutely tell I'm going to get Susie back to talk more about the brain at some point. You've had a go.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. I've just got quite a general question. I hope you can help me understand. I was really interested by the fact that you said that you didn't, there's not enough understanding about the fundamental cause of depression. And I was wondering if it's unique to the brain, or is it drugs for different parts of the body, different targets, behave similarly, and therefore that leads to the future is that should we expect treatments to come out that can be 100% effective for everybody, or is this system uniquely complex?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you'll probably have something else to say about this as well. Yeah, so I mean, I think from that you're sort of getting at these perhaps different causes of depression that we were talking about earlier. Is that right? Yeah. And so that's why depression is such an interesting disorder to study, but also makes it so tricky, and it's probably one of the reasons why we have had such a difficult time trying to find effective treatments. And I think, as you said, probably explains why at the moment we don't have a one single cure-all to depression is because it is, as we sort of alluded to earlier, perhaps the brain's way of responding to a problem in the body. And so, sort of what we know is that some people seem to have probably a kind of hormonal cause of their depression. Some people might have an inflammatory cause to their depression. So really interestingly, there's been a new set of medications called kind of monoclonal antibodies, which we use for other kind of inflammatory disorders. They're kind of our new thing that's coming out to help treat inflammation and inflammatory disorders. And some of the drug companies have done some interesting work, sort of trying out some of these medications and finding that actually if you give these medications to people who say have psoriasis, which is like a skin condition, an inflammatory skin condition, or an immune-mediated skin condition, if you give them this treatment, if you look at the people that don't get better with it, they don't get better from this monoclonal antibody for their psoriasis, but you look at their scores on their mood, sometimes their mood gets better. And so this kind of makes you think that actually that for some people there's a separate kind of immune inflammatory response that's happening in their body that's probably the cause of their depression, or at least partly responsible for their depression. And so sort of this has started a new sort of way of thinking about that there's a group of people who are depressed who probably have this inflammatory immune-related kind of problem that leads to depression. But then we know there's a group of people for whom kind of our sort of traditional SSRIs work very well as well. So kind of that's why depression is so interesting, and there probably isn't going to be one treatment. Probably what will happen as things move forward is that we'll get better at stratifying kind of what your cause of depression is and being able to target and personalise that treatment better, I think. I suppose related to that, we know that people seem to, we have a variety of different symptoms that people can have from their depression. Some people seem to have more of one set of symptoms than another. And again, how that relates to cause, we're still trying to unpick. But again, that's the sort of route that we're going down, trying to think about personalised treatments for, actually, are you somebody that's more struggling with kind of motivation, getting yourself going, thinking when you're at work with your depression, or are you somebody that's actually really struggling to sleep related to your depression? What does that say about your cause, and what can that mean for your treatment?
Very good. I'm going to have to pick up on that because there's a brilliant one earlier. Got to get the right bit. Okay, so this is picking up on a previous cafe where we were talking about the connection between the gut and the brain and saying potentially could the state of your gut bacteria be a causal factor, in which case could the therapeutic consumption of rhubarb crumble offer a cleansing solution? And so I just thought that was a great comment, but also just wanted to ask this one, which is an interesting one. Are there hotspots of depression around the country? And if so, are there any environmental causal links?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question about the microbiome, and you probably heard some of it in the previous cafe, but there's lots and lots of interest in this area, and that extends into mental illness and depression as well. And there have been some early studies that have given a little bit of evidence to suggest, for example, that taking probiotics does have an impact on some of the kind of cognitive measures that we think are related to depression that we've talked about here. So it's early days, I think, but the initial evidence that's coming out would be consistent with the idea that perhaps that would be another way that you could impact upon mood. And we're just about to start a study looking at mood disturbance in perimenopausal women and using probiotics in that group. I think it's particularly well suited to that kind of population level. You haven't got such severe depression that you're meeting full criteria for a depressive episode, but you're kind of struggling with your mood, and perhaps targeting the microbiome might be one useful way to go. The second question.
Causes, any
Oh yeah. So I think the most evidence well, obviously the environment has an enormous impact on risk for depression. So rates of depression are higher in urban areas, they're higher in areas of low socioeconomic areas. I think I don't know about there's a lot of interest in whether you can use things like green spaces to promote mental well-being. I think it's a really nice idea, and there's a lot of work that's going to happen. I'm not sure whether the evidence is really very strong in terms of depression risk at the moment, but certainly it's there, and I guess the fact that depression is higher in urban areas will be consistent with that.
Yeah, and there was that study, wasn't there, that looked at showing that your rates of all mental illness, but particularly depression, were kind of directly related to how close you were to a main road, weren't there?
Right. Yeah.
And then it's trying to unpick, what is it about the
Yeah.
main road that's the problem? Is it the
Yeah.
pollution?
Yeah.
Is it the traffic noise?
Yeah.
Does that just mean that people are likely to be much more on top of each other?
Yeah.
Is that because that's, you know, a lower socioeconomic area? So that's the problem when often we do this sort of observational type research, is we find a link, but that doesn't necessarily tell us about the cause.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's really interested by the idea that there's like different systems that cause different potential types of depression. And do you think the, for example, the objective facial markers or something like this would be able to get to the stage where you can identify like different types of depression and potentially link that back to the cause, or is that just not realistic?
I think the inflammation example that Angharad gave is a really good one, because if that's the case, then you should be able to measure levels of inflammation at the beginning, CRP levels, and then target your treatment to those particular patients. I don't think our evidence base is quite there yet, but that's the dream. And maybe have other ways of profiling patients at the beginning to know which drug would, or which treatment would be best for them. So it's certainly the direction of travel in the field, but it's remarkably difficult to find predictors of antidepressant response.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about that inflammation, I think that's, you know, when we first thought about this, you know, we did think, that's going to explain everybody that has treatment-resistant depression, the depression that we can't treat at the moment. Excellent. And then actually, if you take that group of people that don't respond to our antidepressants, some of them seem to have an inflammatory process and some of them definitely do not. So there's still a lot more to unpick there.
I hope the question is not too like psychology based, but like, would there be potentially different ways, like different degrees of negative bias? Like, is it always just like different types causing subtle changes in behaviour, even? But like, I don't know.
I forgot which way. Am I on now or?
Am I on now?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent question. And one of the things that we found is, so your baseline cognitive bias isn't that good at predicting if you're going to show a good response to antidepressants. But what is good is using your change in bias very early on in processing. So if you look at a patient before they start antidepressant treatment and then after 1 week, that's predictive of whether they're going to show a good response or not. And the reason why that's really great is because at the moment, if you go to your GP and you get put on an antidepressant, you have to wait ages before you know it's going to work or not. And then you might go back after a month or two and say it's not working, and they might change your dose, and then you have to wait again for a month or two. And actually it can take months and months and months before the right treatment and the right dose is targeted at the right person. And this ability to pick up very early on in antidepressant treatment whether it seems likely that that person's going to show a good response has the potential to really speed up that decision-making process. And that was tested in primary care and sort of GP surgeries across Europe in a big study where they showed that if clinicians used this tool to get an early readout and use that to inform the decisions that they made about the treatments for that individual person, the outcomes for those patients that use this kind of predictive tool were better. So they showed reduced anxiety levels, but also perhaps even more excitingly, improved functional outcomes. So that would cover things like, you know, your ability to go back to work and your ability to engage in everyday life. And so it really suggested that getting treatment right early on has a really great impact on outcomes for patients. So we're kind of really excited about that potential to use these sorts of tools to tell us early on if a drug's likely to work or not.
I'm going to do another one in the room, and then I'm going to do, there are some absolutely fantastic questions online. We've got 15 minutes left, so I'm going to go to some of those after this.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, are there any evolutionary benefits of depression, or is it just a no-no? And also, does depression without treatment naturally lead to a reduction in lifespan and reduction in performance? And does depression just go back, you know, for like 10,000 years ago, there was depression then?
That's a really great question, and I'm sure you've probably got. I mean, it's a bit of a philosophical type question, so we've probably got different answers to that. But so I think you're right to think about, does depression have an evolutionary basis? I think yes is probably the answer to some extent. So we know that similarly with anxiety, you know, having a healthy anxiety for your surroundings and things that might be dangerous to you is a good thing. And I suppose sort of depression and anxiety are quite closely linked, but having a healthy skepticism, if you think about the facial expression idea, you know, if you've got somebody coming towards you with an ambiguous face, actually having a healthy skepticism about whether this ambiguous face could be a kind of malevolent face and therefore you need to be a bit worried about it is probably evolutionarily helpful. Or to be able to at least interpret to some extent that that may be a possibility. And equally we know again with sort of the link we've talked about depression and its physical causes and physical links, you know, often when we feel unwell, we often feel lower in mood, and actually if you're unwell, and then a good thing to do is to hunker down and to get better and to withdraw from society. Kind of, you know, there are definitely evolutionary benefits to this idea of having that healthy skepticism about the world and recognising when you're unwell and sort of hunkering down and keeping yourself safe. I'm sure you've got some other thoughts about...
Just to interrupt, regarding the evolutionary benefits of depression, I've read some very interesting reports online from depressed people that having depression basically dulls your response towards trauma, and that's actually quite helpful if you live in an environment where you're constantly exposed to trauma of some kind.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a useful point, definitely.
Thank you. I was also thinking, thanks Susie, I was also thinking that if you think about the human era, it's only in the very recent part, kind of the last 100 years, that you could be fairly sure in most countries that most people are not toting a weapon. They're not carrying a weapon.
Oh, yes.
So perhaps it is sensible to be very sceptical about what somebody might mean coming towards you. Okay, so we've got a pair of linked questions in the same direction. Are supportive friendship groups beneficial the same way drugs can be? And also, would walking and talking with a supportive companion produce a beneficial effect for people who are suffering? There's a lot of research.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things that we know makes it an enormous difference in terms of risk for depression is your social network. So actually, both of those things, finding ways to get out into the environment and socialise is really important. And we know that loneliness is a really, really strong predictor of depression. So absolutely, I think it's important. And I think that's one of the things when we think about young people and the rise of depression in young people, and people worry about the use of social media, I think it's one of the things that's a real challenge for us to think about, because in some ways all of the technology that is available to young people now allows them to increase their social networks, to socialise with each other even when they're in their bedroom, and yet of course it can have these negative impacts as well. But both of those things, we know that exercise is both protective against depression but also a good treatment for some people with depression. It's actually NICE recommended for people with mild depression, and also social networks play an absolutely critical role. Yeah.
And I suppose actually thinking about loneliness being a kind of risk factor, I think the pandemic was a great natural experiment for that, unfortunately, wasn't it? That, you know, lots of people did become very isolated as a direct result of the pandemic, and I think we possibly saw that straight away and are still seeing that in terms of kind of its impact on diagnoses of mental illness.
Ask about laxatives.
Yeah. So I'll ask the other question I was going to lead into anyway, which is very much linked to that, which is actually a very interesting question. If you're talking about there being inflammatory links to depression, could that account for some of the rising depression since the pandemic, as well as obviously the loneliness and isolation? And then we are going to go to laxatives.
Okay. So yes is a short answer, but I think so. I think we're still unpicking COVID and what that means in terms of its effect on the body and on the brain. And I think what we know, what's beginning to emerge really, isn't it, in terms of long COVID, is that a lot of that seems to relate to these microclots. We were sort of having a discussion earlier about, you know, structural issues with the brain and perhaps what that might mean in terms of depression. So it's possible that, you know, there may be structural issues that COVID's causing that may increase our risk of depression. That we've also got, I think you talked about this inflammatory response that may be set off both peripherally and centrally, that may be, you know, related to it. And then we've got the social impacts of the pandemic. And not just that loneliness that people experience, but obviously some people lost their jobs, lost their businesses, you know, and actually since the pandemic, you know, we've had a cost of living crisis, you know, life's been pretty tough, hasn't it? So I think trying to exactly work out that sort of cause of the pandemic and what it might meant is kind of quite tricky.
Can you explain laxatives then?
Well, Susie could obviously chip in with this as well, but really, so we were looking at what we know from kind of the preclinical literature, and so there are obviously some caveats with that, which we've discussed with relating to the animal models, but we know from the preclinical literature that there are a group of medications that seemed to look good in terms of their potential for improving mood and also improving thinking. And that these are called the 5-HT4 agonists, which really means they stimulate a particular serotonin receptor in the brain, but also generally. Now, the specific serotonin receptor exists in your brain and your heart and your gut. And we were already making use of the fact that they were in the gut. So if you give these drugs which sort of stimulate these receptors in the gut, they lead to laxative effects, and they've been used for that for quite a while. But really, kind of, before we started thinking about it, I don't think many people had really thought about the fact that these receptors also existed in the brain and what might they be doing in the brain. And so we've done a kind of variety of different studies, both sort of similar studies that we were talking about today, these sort of small studies looking at human models, but also kind of big data, kind of trying to look at what these drugs might be doing. And I suppose the kind of take-home message really is that they're looking quite good in terms of depression, and they may be having kind of impacts on both on kind of people's risk of depression if they're on these medications for the constipation purposes, but also kind of thinking about our models and what they're showing in terms of kind of how they might be affecting people's thought processes and ability to kind of think better.
I just assume that laxatives work directly on the the rectum.
Yeah, yeah, they do. But as Angharad says, there's these receptors in the gut, which is what's responsible for their laxative effects, but then also the same receptors in the brain. And so what we've been interested in over the last few years, and Angharad looked at in her PhD, was we know that if we give this drug, it's stimulating these receptors. Does that have any effects on cognition? Because it should be having an effect in the brain. And what we've seen is really quite remarkable effects on cognition. And so that's led us to think that perhaps this drug that's at the moment licensed for people with chronic constipation could also be repurposed as an antidepressant. And that's another route into treatment development that we haven't really talked about, but you don't have to go through this, let's start in animals, let's go into humans and establish safety, let's go further on. Actually, repurposing drugs is a commonly used way in psychiatry to develop new drugs. So things like ketamine that we were talking about was used for other indications way before it became interesting as an antidepressant. So what we're interested in doing, not all laxatives we think are antidepressants, we think it's unrelated to their laxative properties, but because there's also this receptor in the brain, we're interested in whether it might be a useful antidepressant.
Thank you. Cheers. Great to hear you talking about repurposing drugs. We had a cafe going through why you don't have to go through all those procedures right at the start of COVID. So one of the last questions that's come in online is, is there evidence for the effect of light boxes on depression? Perhaps you could actually unpick for us something which I know most of us will be wondering about, which is what is the difference between depression and seasonal affective disorder, because they're both low in mood, but what is going on? They must be very different, I think.
So, there's really good evidence to suggest that some of these environmental factors affect our mood, and the obvious one is the amount of light that we're exposed to. So there's evidence to support light boxes in terms of the effects on mood, but there's also linking back into drug treatment, some indications that things like melatonin, which affect our circadian rhythms, which is really impacted upon by the amount of light that we have, that melatonin can be used to almost replicate some of those natural light effects. And so in some disorders, melatonin might be a useful pharmacological way of getting similar effects. Do you want to talk about seasonal affective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question, and I think my sort of, I suppose, thinking about it is that seasonal affective disorder is really a subset of depression. So it's a group of people for whom actually the amount of natural light that they're getting really is part of their route, their cause into depression. It's probably not the only thing, so they probably also have other vulnerabilities to depression. But if that's not there for them, then they may not have tipped into depression. So these are people for whom kind of the light seems to be their sort of final hit to some extent that leads them to get depression. That's how I sort of think about it. Is that?
Fantastic, thank you very much. I've got my eye on the clock and it is starting to get a little bit closer. One last chance for anybody in the room. Okay, let's pick up one more question for just a little bit of time, something from earlier. Yes, this is quite a good one. So your facial expression tests, have you tested them with people who've just had a session of talking therapy? If so, what were the results?
There is somebody in our department who's interested in sort of form of therapy. It's not quite a talking therapy, it's more an exposure therapy that's used when people have phobias. And so she's been interested in looking, and the reason why that's a nice model is you can just give it as a single session and you see effects on mood. And so she's shown that you do get effects on these kinds of biased tasks if you give therapy rather than a drug. And we're also interested in using them to test the interaction between therapy and drugs. So I've got a PhD student at the moment who's looking, okay, so what's the effect of a week of an SSRI on these bias measures? What's the effect of a therapy? So she's using a behavioural therapy. And what's the impact of combining them together? So it might be additive, but it might be synergistic. So it might be that actually doing both has a bigger impact than just adding them together. So they're quite nice tools that allow you to ask sort of experimental questions like that without doing a 3-year clinical trial. So that's what they're kind of quite well suited towards.
Fantastic.
Thank you. We're going to wind up now. I know that both these two have to rush off because they've got family things they've got to do, but you might squeeze, people in the room might squeeze another couple of minutes out of them for anything you want to talk urgently about before they go. Thank you very much to we'll give you a round of applause in a minute, but just to talk through the next few months. So December's, I'm just going to appeal to all the men in the room, which there are quite a few of. It's talking about the effect of female hormones on the rest of the body. Just want to stress, we all know women, even if you aren't a woman yourself, and also there are still male and female hormones in both types of people's systems, so just bear that in mind. There's a doctor coming from London who's made this his speciality for many years, looking at the effect of changes in female hormone levels on everything else apart from the reproductive system. And then in January we've got Guido Ruiz, who's actually the wife of one of our previous speakers who works in this department, and she's going to talk about the breakthroughs in Alzheimer's treatment, so kind of a complement to this. I think most people have twigged I'm making this quite a brain-led year, which is quite good, and she's titled that one A Pathway to Hope and Progress, which is encouraging, I think. I hope so, anyway. That's the idea, yeah. So those are, as usual, the second Tuesday of each month. As usual, my thanks to everybody in the department for lending us this space, which is lovely, and right down to the friendly guy on the door, and to my helpers who've been fantastic tonight, and obviously all of the people who've come, people who've joined us online, and can we please give our lovely speakers a round of applause.